The sound of explosions faded into a chilling silence. Smoke hung heavy in the air, and the ground trembled under the weight of loss. Among the chaos, one soldier dropped to his knees beside his fallen comrade. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the heartbreak of watching a brother slip away. The world around them screamed of war, yet in that small space between life and death, there was peace. The soldier whispered softly, words only his brother could hear, trying to hold him in this world just a little longer. It wasn't about victory anymore. It wasn't about the mission. It was about one soul refusing to let another face the end alone. And in that moment, when kindness met courage, the battlefield became something sacred, a place where love still dared to exist, even in the heart of destruction. The whispers still echoed in the air, trembling through the smoke as if the battlefield itself held its breath. The soldier's words, simple, fragile, yet so powerful, had become a promise. The world around him was chaos, but between those two hearts, there was something unbreakable. That moment wasn't born on that field. It was built long before, through months of dirt, hunger, laughter, and pain. It began when strangers put on the same uniform and learned to breathe as one. When they learned that survival wasn't just about bullets and blood, but about trust. About knowing that someone would always be there when the world fell apart. He remembered the first time he met his comrade. The day was loud with orders and confusion. Two young men, unsure of the world they were about to face, exchanged a glance that meant nothing at first, and everything later. They didn't speak much, they didn't have to. War doesn't give space for introductions. It forces souls to collide and bind, and somewhere between training drills and sleepless nights, they stopped being soldiers beside each other. They became brothers. Every meal they shared from a dented tin, every laugh forced out after days without rest, stitched their spirits closer. When one fell, the other lifted. When fear crept in during the long, cold nights, they learned to hide it, not for themselves, but to protect each other's hope. That's what brotherhood is. Not loud promises, not dramatic speeches, but silent loyalty. A bond forged in moments when no one else is watching. In war, you don't fight for a flag. You fight for the man beside you. You fight because you know he would do the same without a thought. You march not because you're told to, but because someone's footsteps are following yours, and you can't let them fall behind. The bond of soldiers isn't a choice, it's survival. It's the only thing that keeps the mind human when everything around it tries to turn it into stone. That's what made the whisper matter so much. When he said, "You're not alone," it wasn't just comfort. It was truth. It was the weight of every moment they had shared, every silent understanding, every promise made without words. That whisper carried years of trust, of watching each other's backs, of knowing that when the bullets start flying, someone will always stand between you and the end. As he looked down at his dying brother, the memories flooded in. The jokes whispered under broken tents, the rain that soaked them for days, the time they had to carry each other through mud and fear just to see the sun rise again. Those memories weren't grand stories, they were fragments of humanity held together by grit. They were proof that in a world designed to destroy, they had built something pure. He realized then that the strength of a soldier doesn't come from weapons or commands. It comes from heart, from the invisible threads that tie lives together even in the face of death. In those final moments, he understood that this was the real victory, not the capture of land or the destruction of an enemy, but the ability to love when the world teaches you to hate. As he held his comrade's hand tighter, he could feel the pulse fading, but he refused to let go. Every heartbeat that slipped away was replaced by another memory, another reason to hold on. And though his friend's eyes began to lose their light, the soldier kept whispering, not out of denial, but out of faith, because somewhere deep inside, He believed that as long as he kept speaking, as long as he kept sharing that love, his brother wouldn't truly be gone. The battlefield had turned silent again. The air smelled of smoke and sorrow. But in that silence, something beautiful lived: brotherhood. Not the kind written in books or celebrated with medals, but the kind that bleeds quietly through acts of care. The kind that lives in the smallest gestures: a shared glance, a hand on a shoulder, a whisper in the dark. He thought about how strange it was that in a place meant for destruction, they had found the purest form of creation connection. War had taken so much from them: sleep, peace, innocence. But it couldn't take that. It couldn't take the love they had for each other, because that love wasn't weak, it was their armor. It was what made them human when the world demanded otherwise. And so, even as the sun began to rise over the ruins, even as the last echo of the battle faded into memory, the soldier stayed beside his brother, his uniform torn, his hands trembling, but his heart steady. He knew that this was where he was meant to be, not as a fighter, but as a friend. Because in the end, the battlefield isn't measured by who wins or loses. It's measured by who stood by whom when everything else broke. He finally let out a breath, slow and heavy, and looked at the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of smoke and gold, and for a brief moment, it didn't look like a battlefield at all. It looked like peace. Maybe that's what his brother saw in those last seconds. A glimpse of home, carried by the voice that refused to leave him. The whisper had ended, but its echo stayed. It lingered in the air, in the soil, in the silence between heartbeats. It was a reminder that even in war, kindness survives. Even in loss, love remains. Because brotherhood is eternal. It doesn't die with the body, it lives on in every heart it touched. And as the soldier finally stood, eyes heavy with tears and pride, he knew that the bond they shared would never fade. The world might move on. The battle might be over. But the story of two brothers, one whispering to the other, "You're not alone," would live forever. It was more than a moment. It was a message carved into the soul of humanity itself, that even in the darkest hour, love refuses to surrender. The world seemed to stop when his brother's last breath slipped into the air, carried away like smoke. The soldier didn't move. He couldn't. His fingers still clutched the cold hand that moments ago held life. Around him, the battle had quieted, but inside him, the war raged louder than ever. Every heartbeat echoed with the whisper that refused to die. "You're not alone." It was no longer a voice of comfort. It was a promise made eternal, a thread that tied the living to the fallen. The soldier could still feel it, the warmth that lingered even after the body turned still. And in that fragile space between grief and duty, something sacred unfolded, something the world outside that battlefield could never understand. He looked at his brother's face, pale and peaceful now, almost as if he was just resting after a long day. There was no fear left there, no pain. Only calm. The soldier felt the sting of tears he refused to shed. In war, men are taught to fight, not to cry. But this moment wasn't about war anymore. It was about love, raw and wordless, surviving in the unlikeliest place. He leaned closer, his voice breaking as he whispered again, softer this time. "You're not alone, not now, not ever." The words trembled in the air, mixing with the smell of gunpowder and rain. He didn't know why he kept repeating them. Maybe to comfort his brother, maybe to convince himself. But each time he spoke, the silence around him seemed to listen. It was as if the earth itself had stopped to honor what was happening, a soldier keeping watch over his brother's soul. No medal could ever capture that kind of bravery. No anthem could ever carry the weight of that whisper. He remembered the laughter they once shared, the way his brother used to make light of the hardest days. "We'll go home soon," he used to say, smiling through the dust. Now that promise lay shattered between them. The soldier could almost hear the echo of that laughter in the wind, a cruel reminder of how fragile hope can be. Yet, he refused to let the sadness turn to anger. Instead, he chose to stay, to guard, to whisper. He brushed the dirt from his brother's uniform and adjusted the tag resting on his chest. The simple metal piece glinted in the fading light, carrying a name that would never be forgotten. The soldier's hands trembled as he held it, realizing that this quiet act of care, was his final duty. Not to fight, not to win, but to remember. Because remembering was another kind of victory, one that no war could erase. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and rain. Every breath he took felt heavy, but he didn't leave. Others around him moved on, called by orders, by survival. But he couldn't. His place was here, beside his brother, whispering into the silence. He didn't speak about the battle or the pain or the loss. He spoke about home, about the trees that lined their village road, about the laughter of children, about the sunsets they both swore they'd see again. His words painted memories into the broken sky, and for a moment, the battlefield felt less cruel. As the minutes stretched, the soldier realized something. He wasn't just comforting his brother, he was saving himself. Each whisper, each word, kept his own heart from collapsing under the weight of despair. Kindness had become his armor now. Not the kind forged in iron, but the kind born from love. It was invisible, but it was stronger than steel. Because only a man who has truly loved can endure pain like this and still remain gentle. The wind began to pick up, carrying dust and ashes, blurring the horizon. He looked up and saw the faintest light breaking through the clouds. The storm had passed. Nature, in its quiet mercy, was making space for peace. He took a deep breath, his hand still holding his brother's. "Rest easy now," he murmured. "I'll carry the fight for both of us." And for the first time since the chaos began, he meant every word. The battle might continue elsewhere, but his war, the one inside his heart, was now sacred. He finally stood, his knees weak but his spirit steady. The silence was almost unbearable, but he didn't walk away. He turned one last time to look at the face of the man who had stood beside him through every fire and fear. In that stillness, he realized the whisper had changed. It no longer belonged to him alone. It lived now in the ground, in the air, in the stories that would be told by those who survived. That whisper had become immortal. When he finally walked away, the soldier didn't feel empty. He felt heavy, yes, but not broken, because he carried with him the most powerful truth a man can ever learn: love does not end where life does. It continues, unseen but unyielding. It follows every step, every breath, every memory. It becomes the echo that pushes a man to live with purpose, even after the one he loved is gone. As he reached the edge of the field, he turned back once more. The wind brushed against him, and for a fleeting second, he thought he heard it. The faint echo of his brother's voice, whispering back, "I know." It wasn't real, maybe. But it didn't have to be. Some bonds are beyond explanation, beyond sight. They exist in the space between heartbeats, in the quiet promise that no one truly dies if they are remembered with love. The soldier kept walking, his steps steady, his eyes forward. Behind him lay loss, ahead of him duty. But within him there was peace, because he had done what few men ever truly do. He had faced death and responded not with fear, but with compassion. He had stood in the storm and chosen kindness. And in doing so, he had proven that even on a battlefield, the greatest act of courage is not pulling the trigger, but holding a hand. That night, when he finally closed his eyes, he could still feel it. The faint warmth of that final touch, the whisper that would forever live inside him. "You're not alone." It was no longer something he said to another, it had become something he believed for himself. Because in that act of love, in that whisper of humanity amid chaos, he had discovered something far greater than victory. He had found the strength to live with a heart that had seen both the horror of war and the beauty of brotherhood. And that, more than anything, was the true meaning of being a soldier. The night was long, but peace had finally settled in the soldier's chest. Yet peace in war never lasts. It comes like a quiet visitor, stays for a heartbeat, and then disappears into the smoke again. He walked through the ruins with steps that felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from everything he carried within him. The memories, the voice, the whisper that refused to fade. "You're not alone." Those words were no longer a farewell. They had become a fire that burned quietly inside him, keeping him alive in a world that had forgotten what warmth felt like. As dawn broke, the battlefield lay still, scattered with stories the world would never hear. Every broken helmet, every faded dog tag told its own truth. But among all the silence, one figure stood, motionless, watching the light stretch across the wounded land. The soldier looked around, and for the first time, he saw not destruction, but presence. The presence of those who had given everything. The presence of loyalty, of courage, of sacrifice. And in that realization, he understood something he never had before. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the quiet decision to stay when everything inside you wants to run. He remembered that moment with his fallen brother. The stillness, the hand he refused to let go of, the whispers that weren't meant to change fate but to honor it. That act, that silent presence, had done something extraordinary. It hadn't stopped death, but it had defeated loneliness. It had turned a cruel ending into a sacred moment of love. And that was the kind of power the world often forgets exists. He realized that being strong isn't about how much pain you can bear, it's about how much heart you can show when pain tries to destroy you. Real strength is not the scream of rage, it's the whisper of kindness. It's staying beside someone when there's nothing left to give, no hope of saving them, no reward waiting at the end. Just a choice to be there. That's what his brother had taught him without saying a word. He sat on the broken edge of a wall, eyes scanning the horizon, as the wind brushed against his face. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to breathe without guilt. He thought of how many times he'd mistaken silence for weakness. But now he knew, silence can be powerful. Presence can be louder than 1,000 words. You don't always need to speak to give comfort. Sometimes, just staying becomes the most profound act of love a human being can offer. As he closed his eyes, he remembered the moments they used to share before battles. The quiet nods, the unspoken understanding, the way they could read each other without sound. That's how soldiers survive, not by shouting commands, but by listening to the silence between them. That silence holds trust, and trust is everything when death is only a breath away. He opened his eyes and looked down at his hands. Hands that had carried weapons, built fires, and now carried memories. How strange, he thought, that these same hands could destroy and heal, take and give, end and protect. It made him realize that true power doesn't lie in force. It lies in choice. The choice to protect rather than to harm. The choice to hold instead of to strike. He stood up again and began to walk through the wreckage, passing by places where laughter once echoed. The camp was gone, but the spirit of those who lived remained in the air, like invisible footprints leading him forward. Every time he took a step, he could feel his brother walking beside him unseen, but not absent. That's when he truly understood. The silent power of presence doesn't end with death. It lingers. It travels with you, quietly guiding, reminding, strengthening. When he came across a wounded soldier sitting against a fallen tree, he saw the same fear he once had. The trembling hands, the distant eyes searching for something to hold on to. Without a word, he knelt down beside him. No grand speeches, no promises, just presence. The same kind of presence his brother gave him. The soldier looked at him, confused at first, and then slowly his breathing began to calm. That's all it took, a moment of human connection. The simple act of saying, "Your I am here," without even opening your mouth. It hit him then, deeper than any bullet ever could. This was what his brother's whisper had meant. "You're not alone," wasn't only for that moment of death. It was for life itself. It was a command to carry forward, to become that presence for others, to pass it on. The gift of kindness isn't meant to stop with one person. It travels through hearts, through actions, through the smallest gestures that often go unseen. The soldier looked up at the sky, now painted in orange and gold. The sun rose slowly, as if careful not to disturb the quiet. He felt the warmth on his face, and for a moment, it felt like his brother's hand again. That familiar comfort. That strength that doesn't shout, doesn't demand. It just stays. The kind of strength that can hold the weight of grief and still walk with gentleness. He realized that day that presence is a kind of healing. It doesn't erase pain, but it shares it. It divides it, makes it bearable. And in doing so, it transforms suffering into something sacred. The world may never remember the soldier's name or the whisper that held back the darkness, but it will remember the feeling, the quiet, steady love that stayed when everything else fell apart. As the soldier walked away from the ruins, he didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. His brother was everywhere. In the air, in the ground, in the beating of his own heart. That whisper had become his way of living, to be present, to stay, to give warmth in the coldest moments of life. Because in the end, he realized, the true measure of a man isn't how loudly he fights, but how deeply he cares, the silent power of presence. The choice to stand beside someone when words fail is the kind of strength that outlives war, time, and death itself. And as the sun climbed higher, its light touching the scarred earth with gentleness, it felt like a promise kept. The whisper was still alive. And so was he. The sun climbed higher, washing the battlefield in soft light, as if the heavens were finally ready to forgive what the earth could not. The soldier walked slowly, his boots pressing into the broken soil that once trembled with chaos. Every step carried a memory, every breath carried a name. The world had grown quiet now, but silence has a way of speaking louder than war ever could. And in that silence, he heard something deep within. Something his brother had left behind. Not a command, not an order, but a calling. The realization struck him like a wave. What he had done beside his fallen brother wasn't an act of duty. It was something beyond that. It was humanity breaking through the armor of obedience. He remembered the look in his brother's eyes before they closed forever. Peaceful, almost grateful. No one had ordered him to stay. There had been no radio command, no strategic purpose, no officer telling him to kneel beside a dying man. But he stayed. He stayed because the heart sometimes knows what the rules never can. That moment wasn't written in the soldier's manual, nor could it ever be. It was something pure, something raw. It was compassion, unmeasured, unplanned, unstoppable. For so long, he had believed that being a soldier meant following orders, standing tall, showing no weakness. But now, walking through the fading echoes of battle, he realized that the greatest act of strength had come when he disobeyed everything he was taught. When he chose heart over command, when he allowed himself to feel. Because in that moment, when he chose to hold his brother's hand instead of moving on, he wasn't following duty. He was following something far greater, the call of the human spirit. He stopped and looked around. The battlefield stretched endlessly before him, scarred and silent. Yet, in those scars, he saw something beautiful, a strange kind of honesty. War strips everything away until all that remains is truth. And the truth was this: beneath every uniform, beyond every rank, beats a heart that just wants to love and be loved. He thought about how many times he had been told that emotions make a soldier weak. But now, he knew better. The real weakness is losing your ability to feel. The real danger is forgetting your humanity in the name of strength. What his brother taught him, in those last trembling moments, was that compassion is not a distraction. It's the soul's highest form of courage. To kneel beside a dying man and whisper comfort is to rise above the madness of war. It is to defy the cold machinery of battle with something eternal, kindness. He could still feel the warmth of his brother's hand in his own. It wasn't a memory. It was an energy that still lived in him. It reminded him that duty might end with the mission, but love never ends. And maybe that was the real purpose behind all of it. Maybe he wasn't meant to survive just to fight another day. Maybe he survived to carry that lesson into the world, to show that compassion belongs even where cruelty tries to reign. As he walked, he noticed a group of young soldiers ahead sitting quietly, their faces pale and uncertain. They looked like ghosts of what he once was, hungry for direction, afraid to feel. He approached them slowly, the weight of experience in his eyes. They looked up at him, expecting commands, expecting the tone of a hardened man. But instead, he sat down among them, silent for a while. The sun fell across their faces, warm and still. He told them about his brother, not as a tale of war, but as a story of love. He spoke about how sometimes the hardest choice is to stay when everything tells you to move on. How sometimes the bravest act is to be gentle in a world built to make you hard. He told them that medals and glory fade, but the way you make someone feel in their last moment, that stays forever. They listened quietly, some with tears they tried to hide. And in that quiet circle, for the first time, those young soldiers felt something different. They felt the weight of humanity inside the uniform. The soldier looked at them, saw their eyes soften, and knew his brother's whisper had reached them too. That whisper, "You're not alone," was spreading past from one soul to another, like a flame that refused to die. That's when he understood the real meaning of his survival. He wasn't spared by chance. He was spared to remind others that even in the heart of war, kindness can command the battlefield. He stood again, his body tired but his heart steady. The rules of war would always demand obedience, but the laws of the soul, those are unbreakable. Compassion doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait for the right time or place. It moves where it's needed, even if it means standing against the tide. And that's exactly what he had done. He had once believed courage meant charging forward with a weapon in hand. Now, he knew courage could mean holding that weapon still. Courage could mean laying it down and offering a hand instead. It could mean defying fear not through violence, but through love. Because sometimes, the most heroic act a soldier can perform is to see the enemy as human, to see the fallen as family, and to choose to be kind even when kindness makes no sense. As the day began to fade, he found himself standing where it had all begun, where his brother had fallen. The wind whispered through the grass, gentle and familiar. He closed his eyes and smiled faintly. "I kept my promise," he whispered into the air. "I carried it forward." For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The presence of his brother was everywhere, in the sky, in the earth, in the hearts he had touched. Compassion had outlasted death, outranked command, and rewritten what it meant to be strong. He realized that the true battlefield wasn't out there among bullets and orders. It was inside the human heart. And on that field, love had won. As night descended, the soldier walked away, his shadow stretching long across the ground. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. What he carried was enough. The quiet, eternal truth that when compassion outranks command, humanity survives. And that whisper, born in the chaos of war, would continue to echo through generations. "You're not alone." The night had fallen again, calm yet heavy, as if the sky itself remembered what the earth had endured. The soldier walked alone beneath a blanket of stars, their faint light flickering over the remnants of what used to be life. Broken helmets, torn flags, silent weapons buried in the dust. Each one was a story unfinished. Each one carried a name that once laughed, dreamed, and believed. The wind moved through the silence like a whisper of ghosts, and he could almost hear it, the voice that had followed him through every step since that day. "You're not alone." Those words no longer echoed from his brother's lips. They lived now inside him, carved deep into the part of him that refused to fade. But with them came a weight no weapon could lift, no victory could erase. It was the price of brotherhood, the price of loving someone enough to carry their memory longer than your own peace. He sat down against a shattered wall, the kind that once offered shelter, but now stood only as a skeleton of the past. He removed his helmet and stared at the stars. They were bright tonight, cruelly beautiful, indifferent to the pain below. He wondered if his brother could see them too from wherever he was now. And then he wondered if maybe, just maybe, that light was him, shining down, reminding him to keep walking. The battlefield had ended, but the battle within hadn't. That's the truth no one tells you about war. It doesn't end when the guns go silent. It follows you home. It hides in your chest. It breathes in your sleep. The soldier carried his brother's voice through every sunrise and every lonely night. It became a rhythm inside him, steady and haunting. And though he smiled sometimes, though he spoke to others and told them it was fine, part of him still lived in that moment. The whisper, the hand, the silence that came after. He remembered how they used to joke that fear was temporary, that soldiers don't cry, that loss is part of the job. But standing here, he knew none of that was true. Fear doesn't fade, it changes shape. It becomes memory, it becomes guilt. And crying is not weakness. It's proof you can still feel. It's proof that the soul survived where the body shouldn't have. As the night deepened, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his brother's dog tag. The metal was cold, its edges worn smooth from being held too often. He turned it in his hand, letting it catch the moonlight. This small piece of metal, this simple thing, held more weight than the entire war. It wasn't just a name. It was laughter. It was loyalty. It was everything that made the soldier human again. He closed his eyes and saw flashes. His brother's grin when they shared stolen coffee, the way he'd hum quietly before a mission, the quiet bravery in his eyes when the world fell apart. Those moments hurt to remember, but they also healed. Because even though the pain stayed, so did the love. And maybe that was the balance of life. The same thing that breaks you is what keeps you alive. He looked up again at the sky. The stars had started to move behind thin clouds. The world was changing, even when he wasn't ready. That's what grief does. It freezes time for one person while everything else moves on. But he couldn't stay frozen forever. His brother wouldn't have wanted that. That whisper, "You're not alone," wasn't meant to hold him back. It was meant to carry him forward. He thought of the young soldiers he had spoken to earlier, the way they had listened with quiet eyes, the way something had shifted in them when they heard his story. That's when he understood the real meaning of carrying the memory. It wasn't about sorrow. It was about continuation. The whisper had to travel beyond him, beyond that field, beyond the pain. His brother's voice had become his own, and his mission now was not to fight battles, but to keep that voice alive in others. The soldier stood slowly, his knees aching, his heart steady. He looked out over the dark land and whispered into the night, "You're with me." The wind answered softly, brushing past his face like a familiar touch, and in that moment he smiled, a fragile, honest smile. The kind that comes when pain turns into peace, not because it disappears, but because you learn to walk with it. He began to move again, one step at a time, feeling the earth beneath his boots. Every sound, the crunch of soil, the sigh of wind, felt sacred. He was walking for both of them now, carrying the promise, carrying the story, carrying the echo of brotherhood that no death could silence. As he approached the edge of the field, he turned for one last look. The moon hung low, pale and kind, casting silver light on the broken ground. He felt his brother's presence again, not as a ghost, but as a warmth inside him. He realized then that brotherhood doesn't end when a heartbeat stops. It continues in every breath the survivor takes. It lives in the choices you make after the loss, in the kindness you pass on, in the strength you lend to others who can't yet stand. That was the true cost of love, the echo that never fades, the H that becomes part of you. It's the price of having known something so real that even death can't take it away. And though it hurts, it's a beautiful kind of pain, the kind that reminds you that you were never numb, never cold, never empty. You lived, you loved, and because of that, you will never truly be alone. He whispered once more before leaving, "Rest easy, brother." Then he turned and walked toward the horizon, where dawn was beginning to bloom. The light spilled across the ground, touching the earth gently, as if blessing it for what it had endured. In that moment, he felt something lift inside him. Not the weight of loss, but the grace of carrying it well, because that's what brotherhood truly is. Not just fighting together, but living for each other after one is gone. The soldier knew he would always carry the pain, but he would also carry the promise. And as long as he kept walking, as long as he kept whispering kindness into a world that still needed it, his brother's voice would never fade. The whisper would go on, through time, through others, through every soul brave enough to love again, no matter the cost. The dawn that broke that morning didn't roar with colors. It arrived quietly, like a breath after a long cry. The soldier kept walking through the faint mist, each step carrying the weight of yesterday, yet somehow lighter than before. The sky opened gently, bleeding soft light over the ruins, turning everything, broken helmets, shattered wood, twisted metal, into pieces of memory instead of scars. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't look like a graveyard. It looked like a beginning. He stopped at a small hill where the horizon stretched wide, endless, alive. The wind moved through his uniform, not cold anymore, but almost warm, carrying whispers of the past and the promise of tomorrow. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, he heard it again. Not from behind him this time, but from within. "You're not alone." But it sounded different now, softer, calmer, like a memory that had learned to breathe. The pain hadn't vanished, it never would, but it had changed. It was no longer an open wound, it had become part of him. Like the heartbeat you don't notice until the silence reminds you it's still there. He realized that his brother's voice wasn't just meant for the battlefield. It was a call to life, to carry the truth that those who leave us aren't truly gone. They continue through the strength we build from their absence. He walked until he reached the edge of a small village, one that had been torn apart by war months ago. The houses were half broken, walls still painted with soot, but there were people rebuilding, hammering wood, carrying stones, planting seeds in soil that had once been soaked in sorrow. The sight hit him like a wave. Hope, fragile and stubborn, had returned. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there. Life was choosing to start again. A child stood nearby, watching him with wide, curious eyes. Barefoot, holding a piece of bread too big for his small hands. The boy offered it to him without a word, the gesture so pure it pierced the soldier deeper than any bullet ever could. He knelt down and accepted it, feeling his throat tighten. The boy smiled faintly, and for a moment, the soldier saw his brother in that face. A glimpse, a reminder that kindness outlives everything. He stayed in that village for days, helping to rebuild, teaching the children how to plant, carrying water, fixing doors. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was gentle. People began to call him the quiet soldier. They didn't know what he had carried through the fire, and he didn't tell them. Some things were too sacred to explain. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was peace finally learning how to stand. At night, He would sit by the river that ran past the village. The sound of water was healing, like the earth's own whisper. The stars above no longer seemed distant. They felt closer, familiar, as if one of them belonged to him. He spoke to it sometimes, not out loud, but through the kind of silence that carries words without sound. And in those moments, he didn't feel broken. He felt connected to the world, to his brother, to everything that kept moving despite the pain. He began to write letters too, letters he never sent, to his brother, to himself, to the future. He wrote about what he saw each day, the smiles returning to faces, the laughter that dared to echo again, the courage it took just to plant a seed in burnt soil. He wrote about forgiveness, not of others, but of himself. Because the hardest battle was never against the enemy. It was against the guilt of surviving when someone else didn't. One evening, a storm came. The wind screamed through the trees, rain slashing across the village roofs. Everyone ran inside, securing what they could. But the soldier stepped out into the rain, lifting his face to the sky, letting the water wash over him. It was cold, fierce, and alive. And as lightning split the horizon, he whispered one final time, "I'm still here." Not as a promise to his brother anymore, but to himself. When the storm passed, the air smelled like new earth, fresh, reborn. The village lights flickered back to life, glowing softly in the distance. The soldier looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds, and he knew his journey wasn't about loss anymore. It was about carrying the legacy of love through living. His brother's voice wasn't an echo to remember. It was a rhythm to walk with. The next morning, the children ran to him again, laughing, chasing each other through the muddy ground. One of them asked why he always smiled when he looked at the sky. He simply said, "Because someone I love is still watching." And the child nodded as if he understood completely. Sometimes, the deepest truths don't need explaining. Years passed. The soldier's hair turned gray, his hands rougher, his steps slower. But his eyes stayed alive. He built a small home by that river and planted trees along the bank. Each tree had a name carved into it. Names of those who once fought, names of those who once loved. And when the wind moved through those trees, it sounded like laughter, like voices reunited. Every evening, he still sat by the water, watching the sun set in golden silence. And each time it dipped below the horizon, he whispered softly, "Rest easy, brother." The words no longer hurt. They carried peace, the kind that comes only when you've walked through every kind of darkness and still choose to believe in light. He didn't teach lessons. He didn't give speeches. But those who met him always said the same thing. There was something in his presence that made you feel calm, seen, and stronger. It was as if the storm inside him had turned into shelter for others. The pain he once carried had become his purpose. The silence he once feared had become his strength. And when his final day came, he went as quietly as he lived, sitting by that same river, watching the sky turn red and gold. His hand rested on his brother's dog tag, worn smooth with time. The wind brushed past him softly, like a familiar hand on his shoulder. Somewhere beyond the noise of the world, a voice whispered again, "You're not alone." And he smiled, because now he finally understood. He never was. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire and peace all at once. The soldier's chair by the river stood still, his head tilted slightly toward the horizon, eyes half open, as if he was still watching the world he loved. The wind moved gently through the trees he had planted, whispering through the leaves like old friends greeting one another again. The villagers found him there, quiet, calm, gone, but not lost, because something in that silence felt alive, sacred. Children who once played around him now stood beside his chair, holding hands, their eyes wet but glowing. They didn't cry out loud. They smiled through their tears as if they knew he wasn't leaving, just going home. The river kept flowing, carrying his memory onward. whispering his words across the water. You're not alone. And in that moment, every heart that remembered him felt it too. Love never dies. It simply changes its form.